So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to resume this afternoon session with John Peet, Europe editor of The Economist. I will just like to emphasize again, we are in live streaming also at other universities such as Bocconi University, Lewis University, and universities also, other universities in Italy such as Salerno and Bologna, and we will shortly be streaming also to Columbia and Harvard. So I would like to thank Mr. Peet for accepting our invitation at such a short notice, and also for being here today to deliver these remarks. I think we will all benefit from his expertise. I mean, he's an invaluable expert all the issues that concern both Europe, our country in particular, but Europe in general, international relations in general. And I'm sure you will all emphasize also the importance at this moment of having such a speaker here today. So I would just like to give a warm welcome to Mr. Peet and yield the floor to him. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk about rethinking Italy at a global level. I'm not sure I would describe this as a keynote speech, but I will make some remarks. And I think if I understood it, you wanted me really to set your discussion in a more European context. As you said, I know quite a lot about Europe. I even know a little bit about Italy. I wrote a rather negative survey of Italy about 10 years ago. And it hasn't improved a great deal since then. So we give Italy some attention as well at the Economist. And I'm sorry I couldn't be here to hear your earlier discussion about Europe. You're going also, I think, to be talking about foreign policy and aid, and a little bit on security and defence. I don't have much to say about aid, but I will say something about Europe, about foreign policy and about security in a slightly wider context. And I think I'm just going to make 5 points, perhaps in about 20 minutes, and I hope then, if any of you have any comments or questions, you'll join in. First point, perhaps oddly, I would like to start with economics. I come from a publication called The Economist, so that's perhaps my excuse. But it's also because I think if you're talking about our role in the world, or indeed Italy's role at a global level, I think you have to start by talking a bit about its economy. In many ways, I think the economy is the biggest weakness of Europe today. My sort of thinking about the influence of our continent, and I say our despite coming from the United Kingdom, in the past 50 years, is that it's really derived much more not from hard power in the sort of American sense, or perhaps today in the Russian sense, but from what is classically called by Joe Nye soft power. It's the fact that Europe has seemed to be able to deliver high and rising living standards, decent democratic civil societies, contented, broadly, voters and citizens. And I think many people think that the performance of Europe since the Second World War has been pretty remarkable in this general respect. And it's enabled the European project, what is now the European Union, to turn into a huge magnetic power. It managed, for example, to attract my country to join, which is quite a difficult task, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But it also played an enormously important role when communism came down, as I think was surprising, but many people expected it was not a system that was likely to last. The Central Europe and European and Eastern European countries obviously felt that the place they should go was the European project. It is still attracting people. Turkey, for example, says it would like to join the European Union, and it's attracting people on the individual level. They don't have to tell Italians how many people want to cross the Mediterranean to settle in Europe. But I think a lot of that is losing its edge now, thanks to Europe's relatively bad economic performance in the last 7 or 8 years. Indeed, you could argue in the last decade. The euro crisis has clearly caused quite a lot of damage to the European project, not just in the sense of its economy slowing down, but in the sense that it's made Europe's image much worse than it was. This is a continent, an advanced continent that seemed unable, and still to some extent seems unable, to sort out its economic problems. And above all, we seem to have got stuck in a situation of slow, or in some cases, no growth. And one reason I'd like to dwell on that is that I think in some respects, Italy is in many ways the biggest and worst example of this. It is the only economy in the Eurozone that is today smaller than it was in 2000. Indeed, on one of our more graphic attempts to describe the performance of the Italian economy, we found some numbers that suggested that only Haiti and Zimbabwe had done worse than Italy over the past 14 years. It's actually, most strikingly in today's situation, it's actually underperformed Greece. The Greek economy is bigger than it was in 2000. The Italian economy is smaller. And obviously, I think at least, fixing this is the biggest challenge for the Renzi government. But I think it's very, very important when you come to look at Italy's role on the world stage and on a bigger screen, Europe's role on the world stage. And in some ways, I think the situation today, 2015, is beginning to look a little bit more, at last, a little bit more hopeful than it was 5 or 6 years ago. It's not just that, to some extent, Greece seems to have woken up to the fact that it's better inside the euro than outside the euro, but it's also that in France they have managed to push through a package of quite significant reforms through the National Assembly recently by using a decree. Italy is making labour market changes. There seems to be an acceptance by Italian and French society that reform is necessary. And even the growth outlook, at long last, is beginning to look a little better. The fourth quarter figures were stronger than some people expected, and it looks as if the Eurozone as a whole will do slightly better in 2015 than we feared. But there's still a great deal of work to do. Deflation is clearly a big threat for the Eurozone. There is inadequate demand. The imposition of austerity, in my view, has clearly went too far. And the Eurozone, compared, for instance, with the United States, but also with the United Kingdom and some other parts of the world, is still looking as if it is a slow-growing area condemned to perform quite badly. And I think that is going to cause a big problem for Europe as a whole when it tries to project itself on a world stage. So that's my first very big, important comment on where we are when we think about Europe and Italy's role in the world. Second related point I wanted to make was about the future of the European project in general. And here too, besides what I've just said about the economy and the euro, I think there are reasons to have many worries. It seems clear to anybody, even I might say people in this country, that in terms of exerting influence in the world, Europe has to do it together rather than apart. Demographic changes alone make that seem fairly obvious. Europe accounted for something like 20% of the world population in 1950, and it's now down to 7% and will soon be down to 5% of the world population. So when it comes to dealing with places like China, India, the United States, or even another declining part of the world, Russia, it's clear that Europe will find that difficult to do if the countries of Europe operate alone. And I think that was one of the strongest reasons for bringing the European project into being. And it's one of the reasons why most people, not everybody, most people would like to see the European project continue. We need to work together on the world stage. And yet, there are clearly risks lying ahead for the European Union. I mentioned Greece a moment ago. A few weeks ago, I put the odds of Greece leaving the euro as high as 30%. I think they've fallen, but they haven't fallen to zero. We may have more trouble with Greece later in the year, and it's quite conceivable that Greece could end up falling out of the single currency, and with that possibly falling out of the European Union. We have several countries inside the European Union that are at best ambivalent in their attitude to Russia. Cyprus is one example, Hungary is another. The UK, I'm sure I don't need to harp on about the UK since I'm speaking in London, but the UK's position inside the European Union is at best, uncertain. You all know that we have a government whose leader has committed himself, if he does well enough in the next election, to renegotiate Britain's position inside the European Union and put the results to a referendum in 2017. And any of you who have looked at referendums around Europe will know that the results of them are unpredictable. So whether the UK will stay in the project or not, I think remains an open question. And for the sake of the European Union, leave aside the UK itself, I think were the UK to choose to leave, I think the consequences for the European Union would be extremely bad in terms of its influence in the world, its position in global diplomacy. So I think that that's another issue for the future, another reason for worrying about the future of the European Union. But it isn't only those sorts of places that that cause me concern. I worry quite a lot, for example, since I'm talking to this group, about developments in Italy and France. Public opinion polls over the last 10 years have clearly shown a rising disillusion with the European project. Three of the main political forces in Italy, the Northern League, the Five Star Movement and Forza Italia, are sounding increasingly hostile, not just to the European single currency, but to the European project itself. And if you move across the Alps to France, it's not just a question of Marine Le Pen and the National Front, but even as mainstream a politician as Nicolas Sarkozy, now the leader of the main centre-right party in France, again, and hoping again to become president. I wonder what French voters will think about that. But even he is talking in an increasingly Eurosceptical tone about the European project, wanting to repatriate powers, tear up red tape. He sometimes sounds, I've heard him deliver speeches which sound very similar to the sort of things that David Cameron says, which I think is quite remarkable coming from a French president. And although I think the European Union would survive an exit by Britain, I am quite clear that it couldn't possibly survive if France were not in the club, and I don't think it could survive if Italy weren't either. So the sustainability of our project and its support among ordinary voters, I think, are things that are worth at least worrying about for the future, and they would have a very big influence on Europe's ability to play a role on the global stage. That was my second sort of broad comment. Third is security, which you will be talking about, I think tomorrow. And once again, since I'm in a rather negative mood, there are quite a lot of worrying trends about security across Europe. I mean, most obviously, we do have what amounts to pretty much a war going on within Europe, since I count Ukraine and southeastern Ukraine as a part of Europe. But that's by no means the only security threat to us. We all know what's going on in Syria. We know about Iran and its nuclear ambitions. We know about the growth and spread of ISIS. And we know of particular concern to Italy about the situation across the Mediterranean, the near collapse of Libya into anarchy, and the rise once again of what looks like Islamic State in that country. I think it would be hard to survey our part of the world without concluding that it has become an increasingly dangerous place in which to live. And yet, despite that, if you look around Europe, you see almost all countries are continuing to cut their defence budgets, including this country. The NATO summit in Cardiff once again committed members of NATO to spend 2% of GDP or more on defence. And yet on current trends, Britain will fall below that next year. Italy is already well below that, as is Germany. And not surprisingly in that situation, the United States, which continues to be the guarantor of security in Europe, is increasingly irritated with what it sees as a Europe that is free-riding to some extent on the back of America's security guarantee. And it's not just a case of Europe looking to America like as if it's rather a pacific place that doesn't really quite feel that the use of force is ever justified. It's that they actually simply are not prepared to shoulder the burden of looking after themselves in their own region. And then on top of all that, Europe continues to be very bad at getting value for money from its defence spending. There is cross-border cooperation in defence, but it is nothing like strong enough. The best recent example was between Britain and France, which continue to be the two countries that claim to be the most committed to a global role in the defence area. And they do have a lot of cooperative programs, but they've made much less progress in the last 10 years than some people hoped when the San Malo Declaration was agreed in 2000. And then if you look at other areas of security, I think you'd have to say that Europe's policies are at best inconsistent and perhaps at worst rather all over the place. And a recent good example of that, I think, is indeed how to handle the problem of illegal immigration. What's been going on in the Mediterranean is naturally, anybody who observes it, heartbreaking. But I think it would be fair to say that nobody in Italy or in the rest of the European Union really has much clue what to do about it. There is a tendency to look for solutions that pass the problem from one country to another rather than to deal with it together. The attempt to replace Mare Nostrum with Triton, I think, couldn't possibly be described as a success. And we don't really, beyond a sort of general feeling that we want to try and find some way of holding down illegal immigration, we don't really seem to know, we don't really seem to have much idea for how to respond to it in a coherent way. And I would put on this sort of set of concerns about Europe's approach to security, the fact that we don't appear to know anymore what to do about Turkey. Turkey is purportedly an applicant country that is negotiating its membership of the European Union. But anybody who's been to Turkey knows that the chances of them joining are very close to zero. And it's not entirely Turkey's fault. It is also partly the European Union's fault. And yet Turkey is obviously a very important player in the Middle East. Militarily, it has NATO's second largest army. And it also has aspirations to play a big role in the Middle East and to some extent even in North Africa. But we in Europe do not seem to be able to find a way of taking advantage of Turkey's knowledge and expertise to work with it in any of these areas. So it's another place where I'm concerned about what Europe is doing. And then fourth point, next and fourth point, would be to touch on foreign policy in the more sort of classically understood sense of the term, old-style diplomacy and exerting influence around the world. The idea of a European foreign policy, curiously, is rather a popular one, even in this country, when opinion polls are taken here and in continental Europe on what are the things that Europe ought to do together. They don't very often say, well, we should have a single currency, or we need a single market, or we need a common energy policy. They do more often say, obviously we need to have a common foreign policy because we're dealing with common threats. And yet, once again, we have a nascent foreign policy at best. And we have now formed something called the European External Action Service, but it's had what I think I would call a slow start. There were many reasons for doubt about whether Cathy Ashton was the best choice to be the first High Representative for the common foreign and security policy in the European Union in Brussels. And I have to say that many of the same reservations were expressed about the choice of Federica Mogherini as her successor. In both cases, I don't think it would be fair to blame the individuals concerned at all. And indeed, I think Cathy Ashton did rather better than many people expected, and I hope the same will be true of Mogherini. But I think that the choice of those two did reflect and continues to reflect the fact that several leading countries are reluctant to dilute their own national role in foreign policy. The two most obvious ones who don't want to do that are indeed Britain and France. So London and Paris are always seem concerned to exert their own influence where they can, as members of the UN Security Council and so on. But also, I think now you see something slightly similar in Berlin. It's very noticeable in the last 2 or 3 years that Germany has started to play a much bigger role in European foreign policy and indeed on the global stage. And it's not just that they have clearly been the leading country in the Euro crisis, but they've also been the leading country when it's come to dealing with the problem of Ukraine and the relationship with Russia. And my observation is that many people in Berlin, including the Chancellor, seem to quite like this. Angela Merkel says that she doesn't want to be seen as the hegemon of Europe, but she quite likes the fact that the rest of the world, China, India, and the United States, is starting to treat Europe as if it's essentially led from Berlin. That's fine for Germany, but I would ask a question, although I very much welcome the idea of Germany playing a bigger role on the world stage, because for many years I thought, rather like Italy, it tended to play a smaller role than it should have done, or should be doing. But I think it is still worth asking the question, can we, as citizens of the European Union, rely entirely on Angela Merkel to project our weight and influence in the world? We can in some respects, and I think she's done quite well, although it's very difficult, on Ukraine. But somebody who is innately, who comes from a country that is innately so cautious and especially so reluctant ever to contemplate the use of force, may not be the best person to lead this continent in an increasingly dangerous world. So I still think there is more work to do to project Europe as a force and to work together rather than to rely on the leadership of certain national leaders and presidents. And then fifth and last, partly because of where we stand in the news, I think it's worth adding a comment or two about Russia specifically. The killing of Boris Nemtsov on Friday night was a reminder of how things have gone badly wrong in Russia. And we don't need much reminder when we see what the consequences of Russia's intervention in Crimea and southeastern Ukraine, and this wonderful notion that the Russians seem to have come up with of a ceasefire, which is actually an opportunity to continue to fight. And we also know that Europe continues to be highly dependent on Russia for its energy security. So Russia is obviously a place that we need to pay a lot of attention to and that matters to Europe, even though it is declining, its economy is shrinking faster than anybody else's, its demographics are even worse than most countries in the European Union. So Russia is not, in that sense, a rising power like China, but it is a place that we in Europe should pay attention to. And what has become clear in the last 5 years, I think it was clear even 5 years ago, but I think it's become, perhaps I should say, clearer in the last 5 years, is that Vladimir Putin considers the European project itself, not just NATO, but the European Union, as an enemy. And that's been a lot of the driving force of his policy towards Ukraine. It was influenced, as you all know, very heavily by the fear that Ukraine was about to sign a European Association Agreement that might have been seen by some, although these things take a long time, as a possible prelude to Ukraine one day joining the European Union. And that's clearly something that Vladimir Putin is not prepared to tolerate. And that's where we now stand. We have a neighbour who is an enemy, not just of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but also of the European Union itself. And what makes this especially difficult for us is that Russia, and Putin in particular, have become extremely good at what we call dividing and ruling in Europe. And he is particularly good at picking out countries that he thinks might be more sympathetic to him than others. And I have to say that in this respect, Italy itself is often a weak spot for Europe. We have talked a lot about Germany containing what are known in German as Putin-Versteher, those who understand Putin. But there are many Putin-Versteher also in Italy, even in her past, including Federica Mogherini, the new High Representative for Foreign Policy. And I think it's going to be very important for the cohesiveness of Europe and actually for its security that over the next year or two, and it could be a long time, could be 5-6 years, we need to have a solid front against a revanchist Russia that wants to revise the outcome, in effect, the outcome of the Cold War. We need to be absolutely solid as members of NATO with our Baltic friends who are also in NATO. I think we do need to sustain sanctions against a country that has clearly overturned the post-war consensus that you cannot change borders by force. And I think, again, thinking of the events of last Friday, we need to see Putin as a threat, the threat that he is, particularly to his own people. And this applies also to energy, and I very much welcome the fact that the European Union is now at last threatening to take Gazprom on competition grounds, and that European countries are doing rather more than they were to diversify their sources of energy. Once again, I think Italy is a country that needs to do a lot more, and Eni, the large Italian energy company, I think has been far too pro-Russian in its activities in the past, and it needs to move away from that. The reason for hope at the end of all that gloom is that actually, in a funny sort of way, I think the events of the past few months in Ukraine have brought home to European citizens, including citizens of this country, that once again, we have to stay united, otherwise we will be hanged separately. And I think that in some ways, what people may look back on the beginning of this year and last year and see that actually this was a very important moment in bringing Europe together on the security front and possibly even on the economic front, partly because of Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin may go down in history as one of the men who did the most to unify the European Union. That's my 5 points. Please.
Thank you. So actually I have a question from Mirko in Rome. So he's saying, shortly in the previous panel we were talking about how in a way Renzi lost the opportunity to capitalize on his victories, big victory in the European elections. And do you also see the appointment of Mogherini as, in a way, a lost opportunity? We should have gone for some other commission, post in the commission, and also based on Ashton's mandate, do you see any hope or do you have any recommendations for Mogherini? And the other question instead comes from me. So don't you think a bit paradoxical that many measures, such as, for instance, the QE, that have been strongly opposed by Germany a lot of these measures are then going to benefit Germany the most. So QE, because of the capital key ratio structure, is going to benefit a lot Germany. So don't you think that the change in narrative, any hope of change, must come from a political change within Germany? Otherwise, there is no hope for the greater Europe, in a way.
Yes, two very interesting questions. On foreign policy and particularly the choice of High Representative, I think I would agree. In 2009, or was it 2010? No, it was 2000. It was the end of 2009. The then British government decided that they would press hard. They tried to press hard with the idea that Tony Blair should be president of the European Council, but it became very obvious quite early on that the rest of Europe wasn't going to accept that, and I don't think he would have been a great success in that job, because it's not a job that suits somebody like him. It actually was a job more appropriate for the Herman Van Rompuy who got it. And then having failed to get that job, they decided, let's go for the foreign policy job. Originally, as you may remember, Gordon Brown wanted David Miliband to do that job, but then David Miliband said, no, I don't want it. So he ended up with sort of like, almost on the day of the choice, appealing to Cathy Ashton, the only person he could find standing in the room. Would she do it instead? I mean, from the point of view of influence inside the European Union, this is obviously not a sensible job to go for. If I had been Renzi, the only man in Europe who actually won the European elections, since even Merkel didn't really win, the Christian Democrats also did quite badly in Germany, he was in a very strong position to insist on a much more powerful job than that internally, economics commissioner, competition commissioner. And so I think he made a mistake. I wouldn't have done this. Whether she's a good choice or not, I'm not sure. She might end up. She certainly knows quite a lot about foreign policy. She's actually quite expert on it. And indeed, she knows quite a lot about Russia, which is quite helpful at the moment. So it might turn out to be something that wasn't a terrible choice for Europe. But I think from the point of view of Italy's influence inside the European Union, I would not have done that. And then the question of Germany and the euro is, I think it's been there sort of from the beginning, and there is an oddity about, I think historians will say this was a very peculiar period, because if you go back again to 2009-10, when we started on the euro crisis, it seems to me obvious that the country that was most at risk if the euro fell apart was Germany. Germany would be the country that would almost certainly suffer most, because presumably we would have seen national currencies reintroduced. The Deutschmark would have shot through the roof. Almost everybody else's currency, except perhaps for Finland's, would have gone through the floor. German exports would have collapsed. German unemployment would have risen substantially, and so on and so forth. So Germany, and besides which German banks were among the biggest holders of Greek debt and other sovereign debt inside the European project. So right from the beginning, it seemed to me that you could say Germany had an enormous stake in keeping the euro together. And yet the way that Merkel, I mean, she's done it very skillfully in some ways because the project is still there, but the way that she has approached every single step of the euro crisis has been to say, well, all the rest of you have caused this terrible problem, and now you're asking Germany to bail you out. And the message has gone across to German voters and German taxpayers that at every stage they're being asked to pay for everybody else. And somehow or other this is costing Germany a huge amount of money, which it clearly is not, and that somehow or other that means they're transferring money, particularly to useless countries in the Mediterranean, like Greece, or even perhaps Italy. So that message is deeply entrenched in German public opinion. And I think it's a very unhelpful message. I can see why she does it, and we know what politics is like. You have to be, there's a limit to what you can do. But I think she should have said right from the beginning, we in Germany have the most at stake in keeping this project together, and the euro has been extremely good for Germany. And what we are actually asking you to do by, for example, expanding demand, setting up a bailout fund, getting the European Central Bank to try and push inflation up, which is what QE really amounts to, is we are taking all the necessary measures to save the single currency. And that will be very good for Germany, and it should not therefore be regarded as in any way something that costs Germany. Germany has shifted a lot over the last 5 years on the euro, because when you come to the precipice and look over and think, shall we get rid of the euro, you immediately realise that that would be an extremely bad thing to do, and highly dangerous, not just for the euro, but for the European Union itself. So I think they will do rather, as Mario Draghi put it, they will do whatever it takes to save the euro, but they will always do it at the last minute. And I think that that has not been the best way of handling it.
Thank you, Ron.
Anybody else? I have a question about foreign policy. Europe is known for soft power, or at least this is the rhetoric and also the reputation. But you said that if you ask a question here about what should come from Europe, it's a common foreign policy to face threats. So now, are you seeing an evolution of what Europeans can do on the world stage on this. So we are no longer the good guys that promote good things, development, human rights, but we are also now taking up arms against the evil forces that come from elsewhere?
I think that's going to be a challenge. The way I would put it is I think that's going to be a challenge. Yes, I think it's true that for many people what we've really meant is, for example, the fact that the European Union is by far the largest aid donor in the world. And I think that's probably a good thing to keep going. But I do think that foreign policy right at this moment is also going through a period when hard challenges look as if they are likely to increase and not decrease. And that would include, for example, debating questions about intervention. We did intervene in Libya. I'm not sure whether the results have necessarily been beneficial, although at the time I think the decision was probably a justified one. We did not intervene in Syria, perhaps, and some people think we perhaps should have done. And I don't think the Ukraine crisis is anything like over. My concern, actually, particularly about German leadership on the crisis in Ukraine, is that I think Germany starts, and she starts, from a fairly strong assumption that in no circumstances could force, or indeed the supply of arms, be a positive thing to do in a crisis like that. And I can see that actually a military confrontation with Russia would not be a sensible option. But I think, for example, the question of whether actually at some point we ought to reconsider arming the Ukrainians is something that is at least worth debating, just as it was in the Balkans in the 1990s. It might be the wrong thing to do, but it might sometimes be the right thing to do. So I worry if we go too far down the route of saying hard power is never right and soft power is always the only answer, that our foreign policy choices might be too constrained.
Hi, so I wanted to ask, do you see any partners for Europe at the global level? So of course there are the United States, but there are also other democratic countries like India. You have the BRICS with the exception of Russia and China. Are there other global strategic partners that Europe can find, since Turkey is no longer one of them, but maybe there's other opportunities?
I mean, obviously, by far the most important partner will continue to be the United States and should be the United States. And I do very much hope that there will be progress in a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which I think is going to be extremely difficult. But if it doesn't happen, I think that will be very damaging for the European project and possibly even for the United States. So yes, I think the United States is absolutely clear that is the main partner. But yes, I think Europe's links with some other regions are not as well developed as they should be. And that might include India. I think it certainly would include the countries of Latin America. I mean, they're not all the same, obviously, but there are countries in Latin America that do have an interest in sustaining, a democratic, decent global order. And we ought to find people to work with. Europe does have quite good links with Africa for historical reasons, and less good links, I think, with Southeast Asia. So yes, we should be also working with ASEAN in that respect. And I wouldn't actually. I'm quite negative about what's happened in Turkey in the past 3 years, but I think in the long run, if and when we move on from the current president of Turkey, I hope that Turkey does come back. Turkey is a democracy. For all its faults, it is a democracy. And I think democracy is quite deeply entrenched in Turkey. It's just that it's gone in a worrying direction in the last few years. And it is in a part of the world where I think we ought to try to find... if we can't work with Turkey, then we're not going to be able to work with many other countries in that region. One at the back.
Yeah, thank you so much for your interesting talk. So a lot of negativity, I mean, rightfully so. But I was wondering, you also mentioned that, politics, everything will be done slow changes because it's quite difficult to do, rapid changes. But what would you think, for example, a country like Italy, would it be best for us to do just our own homework, or is it also a constructive role that Italy could play within Europe?
Yes, I do. I very much think Italy can play a constructive role. in Europe. I mean, I would put out two things that I would want. I would hope that that Renzi and his government will do. Clearly, from where I started, by far the most important thing is to fix Italy, which, as we know, is a huge challenge. But you have to fix Italy if it's going to succeed and play the sort of role that we want it to play in Europe. And he is on the way to doing that. I mean, some of what he's done, I agree with. Some of it, I'm not so sure about. But I don't think anybody could accuse him of not at least tackling reform in Italy with a view to making the Italian economy more competitive and finally to restoring some growth to the country. So I think that is by far the most important thing for Italy to do. But Italy is one of the four big countries in the European Union, and it clearly, when it comes, for example, to the question of what do you do about the British after May 2015, assuming a Cameron government of some kind that says it wants to have a referendum on 2017, well, I think Italy could play a very important role there, because my reading would be that everybody will immediately say, well, that's another problem for Merkel to sort out. Merkel must fix it so that we don't lose the United Kingdom. In Paris, they will be slightly torn between the old view that maybe they should never have let Britain in the first place, and some sort of view that, Britain has been such an annoying country to have in the European project that somehow or other, if they really want to drift off, maybe we should just say, goodbye to them. But I think that gives Italy a very strong role, because people won't necessarily be looking to Rome and saying, please sort this problem out. And I don't think anybody would think that the Italians would prefer Britain to be out than in. So Renzi, particularly since he has this aura of democratic success since the European election, I think could play a very strong positive role when it comes to doing what is necessary to persuade the British not to be completely insane.
Yeah, one more question. Oh.
I actually have two small. So, so the first one, there have been a number of sort of commentaries on sort of Financial Times and the Monde Diplomatique that have kind of converged around a critique of Renzi as essentially a left-wing version of Berlusconi, right? So very much in continuity with some of the kind of populism and sort of, traits that Berlusconi initiated. And I was wondering what you thought about that. So would you agree with people like, Chris Bickerton, who really thinks of Renzi as a kind of a Berlusconi of the left? And the second question is a bit sort of, and if you do, when are we going to see the cover of The Economist, unfit to rule, Anyway, that's for the future, hopefully. The second, however, it is still about The Economist and the kind of narrative about Italy as the anomaly in Europe, as the weak link, as the point at which Europe could break, too important to fail, etc., etc., etc. There was a piece by Perry Anderson in the London Review of Books a few months ago that concluded very, very effectively along the lines of maybe we should stop with this narrative of Italy as the anomaly, because Italy is not at all unique in the sort of European landscape in terms of corruption, in terms of all the kind of real structural kind of weaknesses. And in fact, Italy is the future of Europe, if it's the concentrate of Europe. So it's more representative than the anomaly, and certainly more than we should like to think.
Yeah, I read the Anderson article, and I don't think we will ever accuse Renzi of not being fit to rule Italy. Although I also remember very soon after he managed to elbow his predecessor out of office and take over, saying to my Rome correspondent, well, I should think within 2 weeks we'll be starting to say, well, we've had enough of him. He's not, nothing's happening. It's not working. Changing Italy, I think, is very difficult. And one of the things I do worry about with Renzi, well, there are two things I worry about with Renzi, and they both relate to your first question, actually. The first was that he seemed to me to become far too friendly with Berlusconi very soon after he arrived in office, which I thought was very depressing. And they actually seemed to quite like each other. I'm this is a sort of observation from outside. Obviously, I'm not an expert in all the body language in Italian politics, but Renzi oddly seems to have a soft spot for Berlusconi, and I find that very difficult to understand. The other thing, which also is a reflection on perhaps Berlusconi, is that I have the impression that Renzi thinks he can do everything himself, and he doesn't appear to be very good at saying, actually, I'm leading a team, and they're doing this, and they're doing that, and I'm just the sort of person holding the ring in the middle. He actually thinks that basically he's the one who should do everything. And I think when you come to making the sort of economic reforms that I believe Italy needs, one person can't do it all. However, I do think he has been remarkably successful in some areas, and I pick out labour market reform as one. And he also seems to have been pretty good at keeping his party together, and nobody appears to me from outside really to be emerging as a challenger to him inside the Democratic Party. And I think that bodes quite well for his chances of staying in office, which is obviously the first thing any Italian Prime Minister has to do is to remain as Prime Minister, which is not very easy, as we know from the last 50 or 60 years. And then the second thing, of course, is to get things done. Italy as an anomaly, no, I think that's a very telling point. I mean, in some ways, it's a good thing. I mean, there is a tendency to always be negative about Italy, although I have to say we are also quite negative about France, and we have in the past been very negative about Germany. So it's not quite fair to say that we are the usual British-Italian bashers. We actually bash most countries because we see that as our role. But I do think that there are things about Italy, particularly inside the single currency, that make it a problem rather than part of the solution. And it seems clear to me, I was in Brussels at the time, that there were many people in Germany who wanted Italy not to be in the single currency when it started. But the politics of the situation made that impossible. And there were then many people in Germany who said, when we have a problem inside the euro, the problem is bound to be Italy. That's what they thought. Actually, they forgot about the fact that there were some other countries, most notably Greece, that were in an even worse condition than Italy was. But Italy is a problem inside the euro because, as I said, it is failing to grow. Its fiscal policy has been remarkably tight, actually, over the past 10 years. It's actually one of the few things that I think the Berlusconi government is worth praising for. They were quite tough on fiscal policy as well. Tremonti, in many ways, is quite a good finance minister. But they failed completely to do enough to reform Italy. That's what I hope Renzi and his government will now be able to do. But what is worrying in a way is that, as you say, a lot of other countries have these problems as well. I wouldn't necessarily single out corruption, but certainly economic failings in general, lack of competitiveness, slow export growth, unit labour costs that became too high. You see that right across Europe, and you also see disillusion with the European Union, high youth unemployment, tendency to support populist parties. You see that in many other countries. Indeed, in many ways, other countries are worse than Italy for some of that. So I think it's more that what we thought of as something that was Italy being the problem is actually now Europe is the problem. And I certainly feel that in France. I mean, I think when I was in Brussels, the French would have looked down on Italy and said, well, they're always a terrible country, prime ministers change all the time, they can never do any reforms, their economy is a mess. Now you could say all of that about France. That's rather depressing than the reverse.
Thank you very much. So
Thank you.
So I would like to thank again John Peet for dedicating his time to us, also on behalf of all the people that are live streaming right now. And I'm sure we all learned a lot, and we were extremely happy to engage with you. And thank you very much for coming.